This video will help you take advantage of the step up and the double step up basis rules at death so your family can pay less in tax. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. When constructing your estate plan, while of course it's important to title your assets appropriately, as we identified in my previous video, which I'll link above here, that might not be the end all be all, because in some states, it doesn't really matter whether your assets are titled a certain way, but as how they are used and if they're used jointly. So in today's video, we'll help you maximize the step up and potentially double step up in basis rules, as well as help you avoid making any costly mistakes in your pursuit of that. This way, your family can pay less in taxes than they otherwise would need to. So let's jump in. So as a quick disclaimer, of course, this is not legal advice. I'm not an attorney. And while a lot of what we talk about will be applicable in the event of a divorce, today our focus is on death. And further in this video, when I talk about certain assets, I'm referring to non-tax qualified assets. So these are basically assets that don't have cool tax benefits like 401ks, IRAs, Roth IRAs, etc. Those are titled based on your name. You cannot commingle them or have those be joint. And the beneficiary designation supersedes all other estate planning that you've done. Now you might be wondering, why do I care about step up or double step up in basis rules? Well, simply defined, when you invest in assets, you'll have a certain level of basis and a certain level of fair market value. The basis is what you put in, and the fair market value is what the asset is worth today. Generally, if there's a delta between the two, which oftentimes there is, and you sell the asset for its fair market value, then you'll have to recognize a capital gain most of the time. Of course, if the value of the asset you bought is worth less than what you put in, well, then that would result in a capital loss. Now, depending on the state that you live in, as well as how you've titled assets, when you pass away, your heirs could receive whatever property you have, and they would receive a new basis of whatever that fair market value is at the time of your death. As it pertains to married couples, there's more nuance there because depending on the state and rules you might have applicable to you, that will dictate whether the property gets a full step up in basis to the fair market value at the death of the first spouse, or if it only gets partially stepped up. So let's figure out what's going on. So step one for your situation is to figure out whether you are in a community property or a separate property state. And you can check out my previous video, but for a quick map, I'll link that down below for you to figure out which state you're in. Step two is to figure out whether your property is going to be considered separate property or community property or jointly held property. And remember, that's based on step one, the state you're in, as well as how you've titled and used this property. In addition to figuring out which state you're in, as it pertains to Washington, California, and Nevada, which are community property states, there's further nuance for those who might be in a domestic partnership, which essentially just means legally you're not married, but you live your life as if you are, you share expenses, assets, all that kind of stuff. And we'll carve out a special exception for Alaska, which is technically a separate property state, but the spouses can agree to have their estate considered a community property state as it pertains to their estate planning. So why does any of this matter? Well, really it comes down to whether or not you want to pay more in taxes than you have to. And if you know the rules, you can title things appropriately. So as it pertains to a step up in basis or a double step up in basis, let's do a quick refresher on how basis is defined. And for this, I want you to think in your mind of some type of concentrated stock account or like a piece of real estate. If I'm a single individual out there and I buy a piece of property for 100 grand, I wait a few years and now the property is worth $1 million. Theoretically, if I were to sell this piece of property, of course, single taxpayers get a $250,000 exclusion, but just to keep it simple, let's say the house is worth $1 million and I have a basis of 100 grand. If I sell that property, I'll have to recognize a $900,000 capital gain and pay a subsequent 15 to 20% plus capital gains tax rate. And that's like somewhere in the ballpark of like 150 grand in taxes. Whereas if I simply just hold this property and die with it, my heirs would receive this property with a new basis, and that new basis is the $1 million fair market value. That means theoretically, if they turn around and sell this piece of property the next day, they will recognize nothing in capital gains taxes. This means that if I can hold on to the property until the day I die and pass it on then, as opposed to selling it ahead of time, my estate benefits from saving hundreds of thousands of dollars in capital gains taxes. And unless anybody's on a time crunch, I'm sure your heirs would much rather appreciate receiving a $1 million tax-free asset rather than a $900,000 minus taxes. So what is that? $750,000 of cold hard cash. If you're not in a time crunch, a lot of times it just makes sense to hold on to the assets until you die. This step up in basis rule also applies to spouses leaving each other property. Although, like we just mentioned, there's a bit more nuance depending on your state and how that property is titled and used. As we touched on in my previous video, whether you're in a separate property state or a community property state, separately held property is considered wholly owned by that one individual. That means that when that one individual dies, the surviving spouse would get the money, presumably, and that property would receive a full step up in basis. So for example, if that $1 million home was considered separate property when I die, my wife would get a $1 million stepped up in basis piece of property. Contrarily, if I own this piece of property 100% a separately owned property and my spouse predeceases me, there is no tax benefit to me at that point. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Tax benefits when your spouse dies, is that really your primary concern? Well, I'm just saying, it's something to consider. In reality, you should know how separately owned property is treated rather than jointly held property. Now, instead of owning this $1 million piece of property as separately owned property, what if instead it was owned as joint? Well, in a separate property state, jointly held assets are presumably owned 50% by one spouse and 50% from the other. That means that regardless of which spouse passes away first, the property will get a partial step up in basis, and this is typically just referred to as a step up in basis. Whereas in a community property state, the asset is considered 100% owned by each spouse, which of course that math doesn't add up. But the reason that they call it 100% owned by each is because regardless of which spouse passes away first in a community property state, the entire asset receives a full step up in basis. To see how that nuance plays out mathematically, let's jump to the whiteboard. Let's run through a quick example, starting with a separate property state. And for this example, we'll choose Colorado. Okay, so let's say at the very beginning of their marriage, a husband and a wife buy a $100,000 piece of property, right? They live in it, they live their lives. Multiple years later, that house is now worth $1 million, okay? In a separate property state, since this asset is considered joint, presumably, that means one spouse will own 50% of the asset and the other spouse will own the other 50%. That also means that they share their bases as half and half. And if the total basis is 100 grand, that means one spouse has 500 grand of ownership of the property with a $50,000 basis, and the other spouse owns 500 grand of the property with $50,000 in basis. And we'll say this is the husband's portion and this is the wife's portion. When the first spouse dies, the spouse that passes away steps up their basis to their fair market value portion, which in this case is half the property. So their new basis is 500 grand. Now they're no longer alive, so that doesn't really help them. But what this does do is transfers over to the basis of the surviving spouse and combines with their existing basis of 50 grand in this scenario. That means this 50% ownership is now transferred to the surviving spouse. The surviving spouse now owns 100% of this $1 million piece of property and goes from having a basis themselves of 50 grand to a basis of $550,000. Now this matters because if the spouse were to turn around the next day and decide that they want to sell this property, now of course there's certain exclusions for people selling their primary residence, but just for this example, if they sell the property for $1 million and their basis is 550 grand, that results in a capital gain of $450,000. At a 20% tax rate, that's like 90 grand in taxes, which of course is better than what they otherwise would pay in taxes if they were together and sold the property, but it still would result in a pretty hefty tax bill based on capital gains. Now, of course, if the surviving spouse doesn't, need to sell this property for whatever reason, it probably make more sense just to hold on to the asset until, in this case, she passes away, because her heirs would then receive a full step up in basis at that point to the $1 million fair market value or whatever this property appreciates to at the end of her life. This whole scenario is called the step up in basis, where upon the death of the first spouse, property gets a partial step up in basis. But no matter who dies first, when both spouses are gone, this property passing to the heirs receives a step up in basis. And the step up is to whatever the fair market value is at that death. Let's run through the same example using a community property state. And for this example, we'll use Washington State. So we've got a husband and wife. They buy that same $100,000 piece of property at the very beginning of their marriage, and that property over time appreciates to $1 million. Okay? Now, what's different in the community property state is this $1 million is considered to be owned 100% by one spouse and 100% by the other spouse, which of course mathematically doesn't add up. But from an estate planning standpoint, you'll be pretty happy that they do this, because when either one of the first spouses passes away, they don't split that 1 million into 50-50. It's 100%, 100%, meaning that according to the step up in basis rules, when the first spouse passes away, this whole property is stepped up to the $1 million fair market value. And that means that the surviving spouse now has a $1 million asset with a $1 million basis in a community property state. That means if the surviving spouse wanted to turn around the next day and sell the property, presumably they would owe nothing in taxes. Now, the reason this is called the double step up in basis is because this step up in basis is pretty cool. Now, in addition, when that second spouse passes away, her heirs in this case would also receive a step up in basis to whatever this property appreciates to in the future. So in a way, jointly held property in a community property state receives far greater tax benefits than jointly held property in a separate property state. Now, some of you in separate property states might be thinking something quite morbid, or maybe that's just me. But you might be thinking, hey, if I live in a separate property state, why wouldn't I just transfer ownership of all the assets to whichever spouse is probably going to die first, so that it's all considered separate property, and then that property gets a full step up in basis, and then it all comes back to me as the surviving spouse, fully stepped up in basis. And then I can sell it and save a bunch of taxes, presumably. Well, you can totally do that. However, there comes with some risks. The biggest risk I'm thinking from a planning standpoint is when you do that, what if you are not the first spouse to pass away? Well, now you presumably disenfranchise the surviving spouse that also has all this property titled as separate property from receiving any cool tax benefits. So that's a concern there, is if you guess wrong who's going to pass away first. Well, let's fast forward and just say someone receives some bad news and maybe their mortality is coming a lot faster and we're pretty confident. Theoretically, you could totally transfer all the assets to be named in that person's name and have all that treated as separately owned property. However, you do need to be aware of the 1-year boomerang rule. And that basically states that any assets you transfer to someone who then passes away within a year, those assets do not receive the step up in basis you are trying to achieve. Now, there's no penalty from trying to do this, so theoretically you might as well try, unless you know you're committing some type of tax fraud. But just be advised that if the mortality occurs faster than 1 year, you would unfortunately not receive any cool step up in basis tax treatment. And then there's the third concern as a naturally pretty skeptical person, and that's the, by definition, loss of control you have given up from your assets. So if it's jointly held property, right, nobody can take that away from you. You and your spouse pretty much have to agree on that going to become separately owned property. However, once it is separately owned property, all bets are off. That property could be gifted to a charity that you hate, maybe a governmental candidate you vehemently disagree with, or something even more nefarious. There's no guarantee that that property stays as separate property with that spouse and then that you get it back. So I have a few concerns when people are attempting to do this strategy, but theoretically it works on paper. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have further questions, drop them in the comments below or get in touch on the website. We'll help you get squared away. Have an awesome rest of your week. We'll talk to you later. Bye.